Nobody in that clinic knew what Sable Kerr had seen. That was exactly the way she wanted it. She showed up at Ridgecrest Community Health Center the same way she showed up everywhere since coming home, quietly early with her head down. The job posting had asked for a general maintenance worker, fixing things, mostly, replacing lights, patching drywall, unclogging drains. Nothing that required conversation, nothing that required anyone to look at her twice. She took the job the same afternoon she applied. That was 14 months ago. By now, most of the staff had stopped noticing her altogether. She was fine with that. The center sat at the edge of a small city in northern Ontario, one of those places where the nearest trauma hospital was a 2-hour drive on a good road and longer when the winter came in hard. Ridgecrest was not a hospital. It had never pretended to be. It had a walk-in clinic, a few examination rooms, a small surgical suite that handled minor procedures, and a nursing staff stretched so thin you could see through them. It was the kind of place where people came because they had no other choice, and the staff stayed because they believed that meant something. Sable believed that too, though she had never said it out loud. She kept her tools in a battered green kit bag she'd carried since the forces. She kept her hair tied back. She wore the same gray coveralls every day and replaced them when they wore through. She ate lunch alone in the utility room, usually something she'd brought from home, usually in silence. If someone passed her in the hallway and said good morning, she said it back. If they didn't, she didn't push it. There was one doctor at Ridgecrest she had learned, early on, to avoid. Dr. Callum Reeves was 43 years old and had the kind of confidence that filled a room before he entered it. He had trained in Toronto, done a fellowship somewhere in the States, and had landed in northern Ontario for reasons Sable had never heard explained and had never asked about. He was skilled. She had seen enough to know that. He moved through diagnosis quickly, and he rarely second-guessed himself, which in a place like this, with the resources they had, was not always a flaw. But there was a particular way he looked at the support staff that Sable had cataloged in the first week and filed away under things to manage. It was the look that said, "You are furniture." She had encountered it before. In different uniforms, different contexts, different countries, the look that assumed a person's value based on what they were wearing when you first saw them. She had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do in response to that look was prove it wrong too quickly. So she didn't. She fixed the leaking pipe in exam room 3. She replaced the broken ceiling tiles in the waiting area. She rehung the door on the supply closet that had been scraping the linoleum since September. She did her job and she was invisible, and that was the arrangement. The morning it changed was a Tuesday in late February. A storm had come through overnight and taken the power with it. The generator had kicked on, but it was old and temperamental, and by 7 in the morning it was already cycling unevenly, which meant the overhead lights were doing something between dimming and flickering that nobody had addressed yet, because Sable hadn't been called. She had noticed it when she came in, had already pulled the access panel in the utility corridor, and was tracing the load distribution when she heard the ambulance. Not unusual, but then a second one, and then, faintly, what sounded like shouting near the bay doors. She closed the panel and walked toward the sound. A transport truck had jackknifed on the highway 8 kilometers out. 4 vehicles involved. The ambulances had brought in 6 patients, and there were 2 more coming by volunteer fire. The waiting room, which normally held 12 people in reasonable comfort, was already past that. Family members, a few bystanders who had been on scene, a woman in her 70s who had walked in for a routine appointment and now stood against the wall, holding her coat and looking like she wasn't entirely sure what had happened. Sable stood in the doorway and assessed. She had done this thousands of times, in places with far less to work with. She noted the patients, 2 walking wounded with lacerations, 1 woman who was holding her arm at an angle that meant fracture, 1 older man on a gurney who was gray in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, a teenage boy with a head wound being managed by a nurse who was trying to do 2 things at once, and 1 man on the floor near the far wall who was not moving, and around whom nobody was currently gathered. That last one was the one she looked at longest. Dr. Reeves came through the inner doors at a controlled run, which was the closest he got to losing composure, and started directing traffic. A second physician, someone Sable, recognized as covering a weekend shift, was already with the gray man on the gurney. 2 nurses were managing the fracture and the boy with the head wound. The walking wounded were being moved to chairs. It was controlled chaos, which was the best version of chaos, and it was being handled. But the man on the floor near the far wall still had no one. Sable crossed the room. She crouched beside him and ran through the primary survey in the time it took most people to find a pair of gloves. Airway open, breathing present but shallow and fast, pulse at the radial, weak, rapid, thready. Skin color wrong. The man was in his mid-30s, built like someone who worked outside, wearing a heavy canvas jacket that was dark with blood along the left side. She unzipped it without asking anyone's permission. There was a wound below the rib cage on the left flank, penetrating probably from something inside the vehicle, part of the door, maybe, or the gear shift. The bleeding was not arterial, but it was significant and it was ongoing, and the position of the wound worried her in a specific way that she did not have time to explain to anyone right now. She pressed her hands against the wound and applied direct pressure. "I need a trauma pack and an IV line," she said to the room, not loudly, but clearly. Nobody responded. She said it again. A young nurse paused nearby and looked at her, looked at the gray coveralls, the tool bag still hooked to her belt, and the pause went on a beat too long. "I'm telling you, this man is decompensating," Sable said. "I need supplies." The nurse looked uncertain, then looked toward Dr. Reeves, who had heard this and was now looking at Sable from across the room with an expression she recognized. Not concern, not the expression of someone about to come over and assess the situation. The expression of someone doing a quick calculation about credentials and coveralls. "Who are you?" he said. "I'm the maintenance worker," Sable said, "and this man is going into shock." Reeves's jaw did something brief and involuntary. "Step back, please. Let the clinical staff." "There is no clinical staff coming to him right now," Sable said. "Everyone else is occupied. I've done a primary survey. Penetrating abdominal wound, left flank. He's tachycardic, hypotensive, pallor, diaphoresis. He needs pressure, access, and fluids. I need a trauma pack." Reeves stared at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. "I don't know who you think you, trauma pack," Sable said again, not louder, but differently. The way you said things when you had said them in places where the person you were talking to might not survive your being polite about it. Something in her voice cut through. The young nurse moved to the supply cabinet. Reeves crossed the room, looked at the patient, looked at Sable's hands, and then did what a physician does when they're good at the core of it, regardless of everything else. He looked at the patient's face and understood, in the span of a second, that Sable was right. He dropped to his knees on the other side and took over calling for resources. Sable kept pressure. The nurse arrived with the pack. Reeves got an IV line started while Sable held her position, because changing the pressure dynamic right now was not something she was willing to do for the sake of optics. And Reeves, to his credit, didn't ask her to. What happened in the next 11 minutes was the kind of medicine that nobody writes up in a journal because it doesn't look elegant. It looks like people on the floor of a waiting room, doing the math of what they have versus what they need and making it work. Sable managed the wound and called out observations in the specific, clipped cadence of someone who had done this in forward operating bases and helicopter bays and the backs of vehicles that were still moving. Reeves listened, not because he wanted to, because the patient's numbers were responding, and that was information. At one point he said, without looking up, "Where did you do your training?" Sable said, "Petawawa, initially. Then Kandahar, then a few other places." Reeves didn't say anything after that for a while. The patient was stable enough to transfer to the surgical suite when the second wave of volunteer responders arrived with the 2 remaining patients from the highway. Sable stepped back. She wiped her hands on a cloth from her kit bag, because the kit bag had a cloth in it, because she had always kept a cloth in it, because that was a habit from places where you needed one. She picked up her bag and walked back toward the utility corridor. "Hey!" She stopped, turned. Reeves was standing 6 feet away, still in his scrubs, blood on his gloves that he hadn't removed yet. He was looking at her the way people sometimes looked at her when the coveralls stopped mattering and they had to reorganize what they thought they knew. "That patient," he said, "the positioning of the wound. You were concerned about something specific, the spleen." It wasn't a question. He had figured it out. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly, looked at her, then looked at the floor briefly, which was the closest she had ever seen him come to something like acknowledgement. "We'll image him once he's through the suite." "Good," she said. She turned to go. "Kerr." She stopped again. He had learned her last name at some point. She wasn't sure when. "IOUN." He stopped, started again. "I should have listened to you faster." Sable looked at him for a moment. 14 months of being furniture. 14 months of gray coveralls and a tool bag and eyes that moved past her without registering. She thought about all the things she could say, and all the things she had earned the right to say, and all the things that, in the end, it didn't matter whether she said. "Yeah," she said, "you should have." And she walked back to the utility corridor, picked up where she'd left off with the generator panel, and had the lighting stable by noon. She heard later that they had caught the splenic laceration on imaging. Grade 3. The surgical team had managed it. The patient, a man named Terrence, she learned, who drove highway freight and had 2 kids in Sudbury, would be fine. She heard this from the young nurse, whose name was Demi, who brought it to the utility room at the end of the shift like it was something she needed to deliver in person. Demi stood in the doorway for a moment and said, "Can I ask you something?" Sable looked up from the work order she was writing. "How long were you in?" Sable thought about the version of that question she usually gave, the version that ended the conversation quickly and cleanly. She thought about 14 months of eating lunch alone and heads that didn't turn. 11 years, she said. Demi nodded. Like that explained something she had already suspected but hadn't been sure of. "Combat medic?" 18 months of that, Sable said. "Then they put me somewhere they needed me more." She didn't elaborate. There were things she had done and places she had been that she did not say out loud in utility rooms in Northern Ontario. There were names she did not say. There were faces she tried, with varying success depending on the night, not to see when she closed her eyes. She had come here, to this clinic, to this job, because she could fix things with her hands and not have to speak, and not have to be known, and not have to be what they had made her into over there. That was the arrangement she had made with herself. Quiet, invisible, safe. The problem was that the part of her that had been trained for those 11 years didn't switch off the way she needed it to. It ran underneath everything like water under ice, steady and constant and cold and there. And on Tuesday mornings, when a man was dying on the floor of a waiting room and nobody was going to him, it came back up. She couldn't help it. She had never been able to help it. "I'm sorry," Demi said, "if it's hard. Being here and not." "It's fine," Sable said. Then, more honestly, "Some days." Demi nodded again. She looked like she wanted to say something else, and wasn't sure if she should. She was young enough that the uncertainty was still visible on her face. Sable remembered that. When you were still young enough that people could see you thinking. "The things you said," Demi said finally. "When you were working on him, the way you talked. I've worked in 2 ERs and I've never heard someone." She paused. "You were so calm." Sable thought about Kandahar, about a compound outside Panjwai, where a helicopter had been 22 minutes out, and she had had a sergeant on the ground with a chest wound and 17 years of experience, telling her what she was doing wasn't going to work. And she had done it anyway, and the helicopter had come, and the sergeant was alive. She thought about being 26 years old and discovering that calm was not the absence of fear, but something you could build on top of it, the way you build a road on unstable ground, carefully with materials you don't always choose, and maintained constantly because it wants to sink. "I had good teachers," she said. She meant it. Some of them were still alive. Demi left eventually. Sable went back to her work order and then packed up and went home and sat in her kitchen for a while before she could eat, which was how some days went. The ones where the muscle memory had been called on. The ones where the underneath water ran closer to the surface than usual. She made tea. She sat. She looked at the window and the dark outside it. She thought about Terrence with 2 kids in Sudbury, who would wake up in a bed tomorrow instead of not waking up at all. She thought about the woman she had been before the forces, and the woman she had been in the forces, and the woman she was trying to be now, and how those 3 versions did not always sit comfortably in the same body, especially not on days like this one. She drank the tea. She did not think about Reeves. She had said what she needed to say, and he had heard it, and the patient had survived, and that was the whole point. Everything else was the kind of accounting that wasted the energy she needed for other things. By Thursday, something had shifted in the way the building felt when she walked through it. Not dramatically. She was not that naive. People didn't transform overnight, and she didn't need them to. But Demi said good morning in the hallway in a way that was different from the reflexive pleasantness of before. One of the other nurses, a woman named Philippa, who had been at Ridgecrest for 8 years and had the authority that came with that, stopped Sable at the supply closet and said, "I heard what you did Tuesday. Good work." That was all. She didn't wait for a response. She walked on. Sable stood at the supply closet for a moment after that and felt something shift in her chest that she couldn't quite identify. Not pride, exactly, not relief. Something more specific than either. The particular feeling of being seen by someone who knows what they're looking at. Reeves she saw only once that week in passing, in the corridor outside the surgical suite. He looked at her and did not look past her, which was new. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. She kept walking. It was enough. On Friday afternoon, she was replacing a cracked outlet cover in exam room 2 when her phone buzzed. She didn't check it until she'd finished the job because that was how she did things. When she did, it was a text from a number she hadn't seen in almost 2 years. Her old unit's second in command, just 4 words, "Thinking of you today." She stood in exam room 2 with the phone in her hand and understood without being told. She knew what today was. She had known since the moment she woke up. She always knew. She typed back, "You too." She put the phone in her pocket. She picked up her kit bag. She walked to the next item on her list, which was a loose ceiling bracket in the consultation room at the end of the hall. And she fixed it. And she moved on. That was what she had learned. In Kandahar and Panjwai and the other places, in the months after she came home when she couldn't be in rooms with more than 4 people, and couldn't sleep past 3 in the morning, and couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't been there what it felt like to carry the weight of decisions that you made in seconds that you would then carry for years. You moved on, not away. You didn't move away from things that were part of you. You moved forward with them in tow, and you kept your hands busy. And on the days when a man was dying on a waiting room floor, you did what you were built to do. Not because anyone was watching, not because anyone would know, because you were built for it, and that didn't stop being true just because you changed your clothes. Sable Kerr drove home that Friday evening in the last light of a February afternoon that had finally cleared. The highway north of town was still patchy with ice from the storm, and she drove it the way she drove everything. Carefully, hands at 10 and 2, eyes on the road. She thought about Terrence again. She hoped he was doing well. She hoped someone was there with him. She thought about the ceiling bracket she'd fixed, and the generator load she'd balanced, and the outlet cover in exam room 2, and all the small things that held a building together that nobody noticed until they didn't work. She thought about what Demi had said. You were so calm. She always was when it mattered. The calm didn't come from not being afraid. It came from having decided a long time ago. That fear didn't get a vote when someone needed her. That was the part nobody saw in the gray coveralls and the kit bag. That was the part that didn't fit the furniture. She turned off the highway toward home. The sky was the color of pewter, and the trees were dark against it. And there was ice on the road, and she was tired in the way she was always tired, which was bone deep and specific, and not something a good night's sleep fixed, but manageable. She had learned manageable. She was good at manageable, and tomorrow she would go back. She would fix the things that needed fixing. She would walk the corridors, and nobody would look at her. And she would be fine with that. Because being looked past was not the same as being invisible, and invisible was not the same as gone, and gone was not the same as over. She was still here, still moving, still the kind of calm that you build on top of fear like a road on soft ground, maintained daily, always wanting to sink, never quite sinking. The trees fell away and the road opened up, and she drove through the last of the February light toward home.